I would like to go over the assignment. First, let's take a look at this header. We see here in the source code that we do have a header element with an H1 element inside it, and underneath that we have the navigation using the unordered list, which is the industry standard. By default, this header element is 100% width of the parent container, which is the body. However, as you can see, it does not extend all the way to the right and to the left. How we can fix that is we can remove the default margin on the body. The body tag actually has about a 10 pixel margin on every side. By removing that, we can make this full width header extend all across the page. We also have this gap at the top. Where that is coming from is from the default margin on this H1 element that holds the text coffee connection. By default, there are rather large margins on the top and bottom of your header elements. Again, we can remove that. When you remove a margin or padding, you have to set the value to 0px. Now you can see my page looks a bit more professional. Now let's look at the navigation. What I have done, I have used the outline property to put an outline around my UL element and also around my A elements. Now the A elements are inside the LI elements. I prefer applying all of the styles to the A as opposed to the LI. The LI is essentially just the container. You cannot see the bullet points here because my background is dark, however, they are here. Notice I do have a color and a font style applied to my A elements. You will need to format the A elements so that they look nice for navigation. I encourage you to put outlines around your elements that you are placing on a page so that you can actually see where they are. Here we do have a fixed width set on our unordered list. The LI child elements will be as wide as that. Notice when I hover over the A element, you see the hand. As I go further out, you also still see the hand. How I have done that, I have set the display property to block for the A element. That is a very important concept in navigation. You always want the whole area to be clickable, especially when we scale this down using responsive layout for the mobile device. You want that whole area to be tappable with the finger. So I have removed the bullet points. I have also removed the default padding on the UL element because, as you may recall, there is always that indentation from the left-hand side of the parent container. Now I will use Flexbox to create a very nice navigation system. The first thing I need to do is I need to set the display property to flex to the parent container. The parent container is the unordered list. And notice how easy that was. That is certainly a lot easier than having to float the LI elements. So here I have my home, and notice as the cursor goes around it, the hand stays in place because I have set the A element to display block. Now you can actually see where my elements are because I have the yellow outline around the A elements, and I still have the red outline around my unordered list. Now, I personally think this would look nicer if the whole navigation filled the container. We can do that by setting the Flex Grow property to 1. When you set Flex Grow to 1 for the child elements or the flex items, it enables them to all be the same size. So that was certainly easier than having to calculate the width and to do mathematical calculations. It automatically will calculate the remaining space for you and create equal child elements with respect to the width. Now the last thing I need to do is to center this text to make it look nice. And ultimately, you would remove your outlines. However, I always keep them in there for development purposes. You could also use the justify content property to determine how to space your flex items inside the container. Here I have the justify content property set to space around, so you can see how it equally distributes the space around my flex items. If I set the value to space between, I see how it distributes the space. Notice that my flex items are only as big as they need to be. So you can decide how you would like to lay out your navigation. So as we scroll down the page, we see some products. Notice they are already formatted and they are at a fixed width of 300 pixels. If we look at the source code, we see that we have a section element and we have a div for each of the products we just saw, and there are 5 in total. If we had to lay these out horizontally using floats, it would be quite a task. However, Flexbox allows us to do it in a much easier manner. If we set the display property to flex in the parent container, the section element, we would see that our 5 divs are actually lined up horizontally next to each other. Now we did set a width of 300, which it does appear to override. However, you can see that it is pushing it out of the layout, probably because of the images. It doesn't seem to be able to resize those images. So Flexbox will try to fit everything into that row as best it can. Another very nice feature is that all of these div elements now have equal height. By default, they do not. The height is dictated by the content inside the container. Notice how nicely Flexbox gives everything an equal height for a nice layout. However, this is not what we want. We want the overflow to wrap onto the next line, so we will need to set the flex wrap property. Now look how nice our layout is. Remember, we are looking at 300 pixels across, so it would be impossible to put more than 3. The other 2 need to fall down to the next line. Notice that there is no interference with the footer underneath, which would happen if you had floated these items. Supposing we don't want these 2 to be by themselves on the left, supposing we want them centered, we can use the justify content property, which works with the extra space on the main axis, in this case being the horizontal or x-axis, to redistribute that space. So if I set the justify content property to center, we have a nice layout where we have some symmetry and balance using Flexbox. Most of the properties that you will be setting are applied to the flex container, which is the parent container. There are only a few settings that would apply to the child elements or flex items. What we are doing here in this layout is what is commonly called a card layout using Flexbox. So if you were to Google that term, you could find out some examples. Many websites use this card layout to present information that is usually at a fixed width layout and needs to be equal height also, which Flexbox will do for us. One way that you can find out a little bit more about how a developer is coding their CSS is with the browser's inspect tool. If I were to right-click on an item and choose inspect, on the left-hand side, I can see that item that I've clicked on, and on the right-hand side, I can see the CSS that corresponds to it. Now, if I look to the left at my HTML, I see I have an outer div with some child div elements. And the outer div has a class called OurCalendarView. If I look to the right and I see the styles set for that class, I can see that they are using Flexbox, and they have the Flex Wrap property and the Justify Content property set to evenly space things, along with the Align Content property, so that everything starts at the beginning. So we have these Flexbox properties very nicely set for the parent or Flex container, and the children just follow along without having to use any code for those children Flex items. Using the Inspect tool is a nice way to find out about how other people have developed their web layouts, and also to debug your own web layout. The last thing you will do is to line up this form using Flexbox. Now, we will not be using the typical card type layout as we did with our little menu items, because they were all a fixed width. Because we are working with elements that are not a fixed width, we will enclose the label and the input in a div. So we will have 4 individual rows. A row for the first name, last name, email, and for the 2 buttons. Each of those rows will be an individual Flex container, and the 2 form elements will be the Flex item. Now, in order to make them line up nicely, at least one element has to have a fixed width, and that element will be the label element. Because we want our boxes to line up at the end, we will use the Justify Content property set to Flex End for our Flex container. The label elements will have a Flex Row set to 1, and the input elements will have a Flex Row set to 2, so that they will be relatively proportional. I am using the button element for my 2 buttons so that we don't have to differentiate between the input elements. I have some styles set for both of these buttons so they display as an inline block element. Therefore, I have some margins in between them, and this row also will be set to the Justify Content to the Flex End value. So you want to set the Flex Basis property for your labels and set that to 100 pixels so that everything balances out nicely inside the existing layout.